Leah Johnson was the kind of woman who commanded attention the moment she walked into a room. At 32 years old, she had already built a reputation as one of the top defense attorneys in Washington, D.C., standing at 5 feet 7 inches, with dark, curly hair that framed her sharp, intelligent face. Leah was someone who was used to being in control. Her presence was striking not only because of her physical beauty, but because of the quiet confidence she exuded. Born and raised in a middle-class black family, Leah had worked hard to carve out a space for herself in a world that wasn't always welcoming. Her intelligence, combined with her sharp legal acumen, had earned her respect, but she was no stranger to the prejudices that came with being both black and a woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated field. Leah's father, Henry Johnson, was a man of formidable reputation. He had spent 30 years as a special agent for the FBI, making a name for himself by exposing some of the most notorious corruption rings in the country. Though retired, his influence still lingered within the bureau. Henry was the kind of man who spoke little, but commanded respect with every word. He had instilled in Leah the values of discipline, integrity, and resilience, teaching her early on that the world would not always be fair, especially to people who looked like them. He had prepared her for the battles she would face, but even he couldn't prepare her for what was about to happen. One crisp autumn afternoon, Leah decided to take a break from her fast-paced legal career to enjoy a walk in a nearby park. The park, located in one of the wealthier, predominantly white neighborhoods, was one she had frequented for years, but there was always a sense of being watched, an invisible tension she could never quite shake. As a black woman, she had learned to navigate these spaces carefully, never letting her guard down completely. Dressed in her workout gear, a pair of sleek black leggings, and a loose gray hoodie, she looked like anyone else out for a jog. But she knew the reality. She didn't get to move through the world as just anyone. The tension Leah felt wasn't paranoia. It was the kind of lived experience that many black Americans know all too well. But today, she told herself, was different. She would simply enjoy the crisp air, the orange and red leaves falling gently from the trees, and the rare quiet moment in her otherwise hectic life. Little did she know, this peaceful afternoon would soon turn into a nightmare, a reminder of the very racial biases she had spent her life fighting against. As she continued her walk, she noticed 2 uniformed police officers making their rounds, something she had seen countless times before. Usually, they would nod politely and go about their business, but this time, there was something different in their gaze. Leah's heart rate quickened, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she knew what was coming. The weight of her father's lessons pressed down on her mind, and she steeled herself for what she knew would be an unjust encounter. Leah continued her walk, trying to remain calm as the 2 officers, whose patrol had been routine up until this point, suddenly shifted their attention to her. She could feel their eyes lingering longer than usual, a heavy stare that was impossible to ignore. She knew this feeling all too well, the scrutiny, the suspicion that followed her into spaces where she wasn't expected or welcomed. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Stay calm. Always stay calm. Don't give them a reason to escalate things. The officers began to approach. Leah recognized the taller one, Officer Carter, from previous patrols. He had a reputation in the community, especially among people of color, for being overly aggressive. His partner, Officer Daniels, looked younger, perhaps less experienced, but Leah had learned long ago that silence often implied complicity. The 2 men walked with purpose, their eyes locked on her. "Excuse me, ma'am," Officer Carter called out, his voice stern and devoid of the usual pleasantries. Leah stopped walking and turned to face them, her heart pounding but her face calm and composed. "Yes, officer," she replied, her tone measured. "We're going to need to see some identification," Carter said, not even attempting to mask his suspicion. Leah furrowed her brow, confused by the sudden request. "Identification? For what?" "You're walking in the park alone, and we've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," Carter replied, his voice growing more impatient. Leah's pulse quickened, but she maintained her composure. "I've been walking in this park for years," she said evenly, "and I'm not aware of any laws that require me to carry ID while doing so. Could you tell me exactly what makes me suspicious?" Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension. Carter, however, was unmoved. "Just show us your ID, and we'll be out of your hair," he said, his hand resting casually on his holster. Leah's mind raced. She knew what this was. It wasn't about any reports. It was about the color of her skin and the assumption that she didn't belong. She also knew her rights, and she wasn't going to let them intimidate her. "With all due respect, officer," she said, her voice steady, "unless you have a legitimate reason to suspect me of a crime, I'm not required to provide you with identification." Carter's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a woman like Leah. Black, confident, and unwilling to back down. "I'm not asking you again," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Either show me your ID, or we're going to have a problem." Leah felt a surge of anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe. She couldn't let them provoke her. "Officer, I know my rights," she replied, her voice firm but calm. "This is an unlawful stop, and I will not comply unless you can provide a valid reason." Carter's face twisted into a sneer. "You want to play that game? Fine." He gestured to Daniels. "Cuff her." Daniels hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure. "Carter, maybe we should." "Now," Carter barked, cutting him off. Leah's eyes widened in disbelief as Daniels reluctantly stepped forward, reaching for her wrists. She felt the cold steel of the handcuffs snap around her wrists, the tightness cutting into her skin. "This is completely unnecessary," Leah exclaimed, her voice rising in protest as she was roughly turned around. "You're making a huge mistake." Carter leaned in, his face inches from hers, the smell of tobacco on his breath. "We'll see about that," he said with a smirk, clearly enjoying the power he held in that moment. As they led her toward their squad car, Leah's heart pounded not just with fear but with rage. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being treated like a criminal simply for existing in a space where they didn't think she belonged. She thought of her father, of all the stories he had told her about officers like these, men who hid behind their badges to justify their prejudice. And she thought of all the black men and women who had found themselves in situations just like this, situations that had escalated to far worse endings. But Leah was determined that this would not be her end. As the car doors slammed shut behind her, she knew she had to keep her wits about her. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all the people who couldn't fight back. And she knew one thing for certain. Her father would hear about this, and when he did, there would be hell to pay. The ride to the station was tense and suffocating. Leah sat in the back seat of the patrol car, her hands bound tightly by the cuffs, her mind racing with a mix of anger, humiliation, and disbelief. Outside, the world continued as normal, people walking their dogs, kids playing in the park. But for Leah, everything had shifted. How quickly her peaceful afternoon had turned into a nightmare. Officer Carter sat in the driver's seat, occasionally glancing at her through the rearview mirror with a smug satisfaction that made Leah's blood boil. His partner, Officer Daniels, sat stiffly in the passenger seat, avoiding eye contact. Leah noticed his discomfort. There was hesitation in his actions, but he had made his choice by going along with Carter's orders. That, in her mind, made him just as guilty. When they arrived at the precinct, the officers pulled her roughly from the car. Carter kept a firm grip on her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. As they walked toward the station, Leah's heart pounded in her chest. She knew this place. As a lawyer, she had visited precincts like this dozens of times on behalf of clients, but today, she was the one being processed. The feeling of injustice was unbearable, and it was only beginning. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights were harsh and cold, casting an unforgiving glare over everything. The room smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, a sharp contrast to the fresh air of the park she had just left behind. Leah was led through the hallways, past the desks of officers who barely looked up as she passed. This wasn't their first time seeing someone unjustly arrested. It wouldn't be their last. As they reached the booking area, Officer Carter roughly pushed Leah into a chair. "Stay here," he barked before walking off, leaving her in the hands of another officer who began the process of fingerprinting her. Leah's jaw clenched as her fingers were pressed against the cold ink pad, her stomach turning at the thought of being treated like a common criminal. While waiting, she overheard bits of conversation from across the room. "Who's she?" one officer asked Carter, who was standing by the door with a smug grin. "Just another one who thinks she's above the law," Carter replied, his tone dripping with contempt. "But she'll learn." Leah's mind raced. Above the law? The irony was infuriating. She hadn't broken any laws. She had simply refused to let them bully her into submission. Now, here she was, being stripped of her dignity by men who had sworn to uphold justice but instead abused their authority for their own twisted sense of power. The next wave of humiliation came when they led her into the holding area. As they walked through the corridor, Carter leaned in close to her, whispering just loud enough for only her to hear. "You can call Daddy all you want. You think anyone around here cares about some retired FBI agent?" He chuckled darkly. "You're just another one of them now." Leah refused to react, but inside, she was seething. She knew Carter was trying to provoke her, to get her to lash out and give him an excuse to escalate the situation further. But she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She forced herself to stay calm, to focus on what she knew best: facts, the law, and the knowledge that her father would not let this stand. After what felt like hours, Leah was finally placed in a small, dingy cell with a cold metal bench against the wall. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. She sat down, feeling the weight of the day pressing heavily on her shoulders. She was an attorney, someone who fought for justice, and yet here she was, stripped of her rights because of the color of her skin. As she sat there, replaying the events in her mind, Leah knew she had to stay strong. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something much bigger, about the countless black men and women who had faced similar injustices, who had been silenced, humiliated, and oppressed by a system that was supposed to protect them. She couldn't let this break her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. It was Officer Daniels, carrying a clipboard and looking more uneasy than ever. He stopped outside her cell, his eyes briefly meeting hers before quickly darting away. "You shouldn't be in here," he muttered under his breath as he fumbled with the keys. Leah looked up, surprised by his sudden change in demeanor. "Then why am I?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. "Carter's. He's out of line." "Okay, but I can't." He paused, struggling to find the words. "I can't do anything about it right now." Leah stared at him, her eyes narrowing. "You could have said something back there. You could have stopped this before it got this far." Daniel swallowed hard, guilt written all over his face. "I know," he whispered, "but Carter, he's got friends in high places. If I cross him—" "People like you are the reason this keeps happening." Leah cut him off, her voice low but filled with intensity. "Your silence is just as dangerous as his actions." Daniels looked away, shame flooding his expression. "I'll see what I can do," he muttered before turning and walking away, leaving Leah alone once again. As the door clanged shut behind him, Leah leaned back against the cold wall, her mind already turning to what she needed to do next. She wasn't going to sit here and let them get away with this. Not this time. And with her father's connections, she knew she had the tools to fight back. Now, it was just a matter of waiting. Waiting for her father to hear the news, and for the storm that would inevitably follow. Hours passed, and the cold, unforgiving walls of the cell seemed to close in around Leah. She paced back and forth, her frustration mounting with each passing minute. The humiliation was still fresh, and the sting of being treated like a criminal gnawed at her. Despite her efforts to remain composed, her mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened. She could hear the faint sounds of police chatter and phones ringing beyond the cell doors, a reminder of how disconnected she was from the world outside. But Leah wasn't alone. Somewhere out there, her father would be hearing about this, and when he did, she knew things would change. Henry Johnson wasn't just a retired FBI agent. He was a man with deep connections and respect across federal law enforcement. His reputation was impeccable, and anyone who had worked with him knew he was not someone to cross lightly. Even in retirement, his influence stretched far beyond his official capacity, and when it came to his family, Henry was relentless. Back at home, Henry was sitting in his living room, a quiet evening routine playing out in front of the television. His phone buzzed on the side table, the screen lighting up with a name he hadn't expected to see, an old colleague from the bureau. Curious, he picked up the phone. Henry, the voice on the other end began, hesitancy evident. "We've got a situation. It's about your daughter." Henry's stomach dropped, but his voice remained calm, professional. "What happened?" he asked, already dreading the answer. The voice explained the situation. Leah had been detained in a local park, stopped by two officers, one of whom had a reputation for pushing boundaries. The moment Henry heard the name Officer Carter, he recognized the type. Men like Carter had crossed his path before. Arrogant, reckless officers who operated under the belief that their badge gave them unchecked power. He had spent years exposing people like that, and the idea that one of them had laid hands on his daughter sent a chill down his spine. "Where is she now?" Henry demanded, his voice steely. "They've got her at the precinct." "Look, Henry, I'm going to do what I can from my end, but this is delicate. Carter's got connections, and it might take some serious pressure to get this resolved the way you'd want." "Let me handle the pressure," Henry said, his tone final. He hung up the phone and immediately began making calls, his mind already working through the steps he would take. His first call was to a former FBI supervisor, now a senior official at the Department of Justice. Henry's voice was calm but firm, laying out the situation in clear, precise terms. He knew the weight his name carried, and he wasn't above using it. "This needs to be dealt with immediately," he said. "We can't let this slide." Next, he reached out to a friend in the media, someone he trusted to handle sensitive stories with care. This wasn't just about getting Leah out of the station. This was about exposing a system that allowed officers like Carter to operate with impunity. Henry knew that if the public learned about what had happened to Leah, pressure would build, and quickly. At the precinct, things were beginning to shift. Word had spread among the officers that the woman in holding was no ordinary detainee. The daughter of Henry Johnson was now in their custody, and the ramifications of that fact began to ripple through the building. Conversations hushed, and nervous glances were exchanged. Officers who had once been indifferent now found themselves growing uneasy. The higher-ups in the department would be calling any minute. Meanwhile, Officer Carter, still smug, had no idea the storm that was about to hit. He leaned back in his chair, feet up on his desk, confident in his actions. He had dealt with people like Leah before, people who thought they were above the law because of their education or connections. But he hadn't dealt with someone like her father. In the holding cell, Leah sat quietly, her mind now calmer. She knew her father would come through. He always had, and he always would. But as much as she trusted him to handle the situation, a sense of injustice still burned inside her. It wasn't just about her getting out of this mess. It was about ensuring that men like Carter were held accountable for their actions. Too many people had been in her position, and not all of them had fathers like Henry Johnson. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the cell door opened. A senior officer stood there, flanked by two others, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice more respectful than she had heard from any of the others, "you're free to go." Leah stood, her expression calm but resolute. She wasn't surprised. It was only a matter of time. As they escorted her through the station, she saw Officer Carter leaning against the wall, his arms crossed. He shot her a glare as she passed, but Leah didn't flinch. She held his gaze, her eyes burning with the silent promise that this wasn't over. Outside, her father was waiting, standing tall in the dim streetlights. When their eyes met, Leah felt a wave of relief, but also a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the end of the fight. This was just the beginning. Henry walked over, his face calm but filled with concern. "You okay, kid?" he asked quietly. "I am now," Leah replied, her voice steady. "But we're not letting this go." Henry nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "We won't," he said, his voice firm. "We'll make sure of that." As they walked toward the car, Leah knew that with her father's help, they would bring the full weight of justice down on Officer Carter and everyone who allowed him to act with impunity. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or humiliated because of the color of their skin. And with her father's connections and her own legal expertise, Leah knew they were ready for the fight ahead. The next morning, the precinct was buzzing. Word had spread quickly. Officer Carter and his partner, Officer Daniels, had detained the wrong person. It wasn't just about who Leah Johnson was. It was about who her father was. The realization that they had detained the daughter of one of the FBI's most respected former agents had sent shockwaves through the department. The day before, Carter had been arrogant, full of bluster, but today, the air around him felt different. Tension hung heavy in the station, a sign of the trouble brewing beneath the surface. Captain Reynolds, the head of the precinct, sat at his desk, the phone in his hand, listening to a conversation he wished he wasn't having. His brow was furrowed, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk as he spoke in hushed tones. The call had come in early from his own superiors, and it wasn't just a reprimand, it was a warning. "I don't care what it takes, Reynolds," the voice on the other end snapped. "This needs to be cleaned up. Now." Reynolds knew the weight of the situation. Henry Johnson wasn't just a name to be ignored. The man had connections in Washington that stretched from the Department of Justice to the White House. This wasn't just an internal problem. This had the potential to go national. And worse yet, it was about race. About two white officers stopping and arresting a black woman with no legitimate cause. That alone could ignite a firestorm if the media got wind of it. Reynolds hung up the phone and rubbed his temples. He glanced out the window of his office, where Officer Carter was pacing the floor, clearly irritated but still unaware of just how deep the trouble he was in went. Daniels, on the other hand, was seated quietly at his desk, his face pale, his eyes avoiding everyone around him. He knew he'd made a mistake by going along with Carter, but it was too late to change what had happened. The door to Reynolds' office opened, and his deputy walked in, his expression grim. "We've got a problem, Captain," he said, holding up a piece of paper. "Internal Affairs has been notified. They're coming to investigate the incident." Reynolds' stomach churned. "Already?" he asked, though he wasn't surprised. The deputy nodded. "Word's out. The Johnson family isn't staying quiet about this. I hear they're filing complaints, not just against Carter, but against the whole department." Reynolds sighed. He had seen this coming the moment he heard Leah's last name. "What's Carter saying?" The deputy glanced toward the door. "He's doubling down, saying it was a routine stop. But we both know that's not going to hold up. Daniels is a different story. I talked to him earlier. He's spooked. If this goes any further, I wouldn't be surprised if he starts talking." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, considering his options. The last thing he needed was an internal scandal tearing apart the department, but it was becoming clear that this was going to get worse before it got better. "Bring them both in here," Reynolds finally said, his voice firm. "I want to talk to them before IA gets here." Minutes later, Carter and Daniels entered the office. Carter walked in with the same cocky swagger he always had, though there was a nervous energy beneath his bravado. Daniels followed quietly, his eyes downcast, clearly dreading the conversation that was about to unfold. Reynolds didn't waste any time. "Do you two have any idea what kind of mess you've landed this department in?" he snapped, his voice sharp and unforgiving. Carter's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, unwilling to admit any wrongdoing. Daniels, however, couldn't meet the captain's eyes. "Look," Carter finally spoke up, his voice full of defiance. "We did everything by the book. She refused to show ID. She got aggressive. That's a load of crap, and you know it." Reynolds interrupted, slamming his hand on the desk. "This isn't about what you think happened, Carter. This is about what really happened, and right now, the department is about to face one hell of a public relations disaster because of you." Carter crossed his arms, his eyes flashing with indignation. "You're really going to throw me under the bus for this? For doing my job?" "Your job?" Reynolds spat. "Your job is to protect and serve, not profile people based on the color of their skin. You think no one's going to see through this? Henry Johnson is already breathing down our necks, and if you think for a second that this department is going to protect you after what you pulled, you're dead wrong." Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his guilt weighing heavily on him. "Captain, he began, but Carter cut him off. "Don't say anything," Carter snapped, glaring at his partner. "No, let him speak," Reynolds said, leaning forward. "Daniels, I want to hear from you." What happened out there? Daniels hesitated, his gaze flickering between Carter and Reynolds. He knew that telling the truth would mean going against his partner, but the pressure was building. His conscience weighed heavily on him, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't right, Daniels finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't doing anything wrong. Carter insisted we stop her, and when she refused to show ID, he escalated it. Carter turned on Daniels, his eyes blazing with anger. You're going to turn on me now? After everything we've been through? Daniels looked down, unable to face Carter. I should have said something, he admitted quietly. I should have stopped it. Reynolds nodded, satisfied with the response. You'll have a chance to explain yourself to Internal Affairs, he said. But Carter, as of right now, you're suspended pending investigation. Carter's face turned red with fury. You can't do this. I'm being railroaded because of some privileged... Enough, Reynolds barked, cutting him off. Get out of my office, both of you, and be ready when IA comes knocking. Carter stormed out of the office, his face twisted with anger. Daniels followed quietly, the weight of his guilt still heavy on his shoulders. As they left, Reynolds sat back down, feeling the full gravity of the situation pressing down on him. The department was now under scrutiny, and there was no escaping the consequences. The tide had turned, and there would be no protecting those who had crossed the line. Leah sat across from her father in the quiet of their family's spacious living room. The faint ticking of the grandfather clock was the only sound breaking the silence between them. Henry was reviewing documents, his brow furrowed in concentration as he meticulously combed through the details of the case Leah was building against Officers Carter and Daniels. Although they had both been involved in her unjust arrest, Leah knew that Carter was the driving force behind the abuse of power, while Daniels, though complicit, might still prove to be a useful witness. I've been in plenty of fights like this before, Henry said, his voice calm but edged with experience. But this time, it's personal. These guys aren't just small-time dirty cops. They've got a system behind them, and that's what we're really going up against. Leah nodded. It's not just about what happened to me, she said quietly. It's about the system that allows it to keep happening. If we can expose the patterns, show that this wasn't an isolated incident, we can push for real accountability. Henry looked up at his daughter, his eyes filled with pride. You're thinking like a lawyer, he said with a small smile. But we need to make sure this sticks. The legal route isn't going to be enough on its own. Carter's type? They'll try to sweep this under the rug unless we bring it all to light. Leah understood her father's point. A legal battle alone wouldn't change the culture that allowed officers like Carter to thrive. They needed public attention. They needed outrage. And, most importantly, they needed evidence that would make it impossible for the department to ignore the issue. That's why, over the next few days, Leah and Henry began reaching out to the people who could help. They contacted civil rights lawyers who had experience with police misconduct cases, and they worked with private investigators to dig into Carter's past. Leah wasn't surprised to find that there were previous complaints against him, though none had led to any serious disciplinary action. A few excessive force allegations here, a racial profiling accusation there, all swept under the carpet by the department. But Leah was determined that this time would be different. She gathered testimonies from other victims, black and brown individuals who had been targeted by Carter and other officers like him. Some were hesitant at first, afraid of retaliation. But when they learned that Leah was building a case with the backing of her father's formidable connections, they began to come forward. One evening, as Leah sat at her desk, reviewing the growing stack of affidavits and statements, her phone buzzed. It was an email from a lawyer who had just agreed to take on the case with her, a high-profile civil rights attorney who had successfully litigated against police departments for racial discrimination in the past. The email was brief but filled with encouragement. This is a strong case. We'll not only pursue damages, but also seek systemic reforms. I'll be in touch tomorrow with a full strategy plan. Leah exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the case, but also the growing momentum behind it. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the people who had come before her and the countless others who could be targeted if officers like Carter weren't stopped. The next step was filing the lawsuit, which Leah and her legal team did swiftly. It named both officers Carter and Daniels, as well as the police department for its failure to properly discipline officers involved in repeated acts of misconduct. The lawsuit alleged civil rights violations, false arrest, and racial discrimination, backed by a thorough timeline of Carter's misconduct and the testimonies of other victims. As expected, the media began to take notice. Leah's case was exactly the kind of story that resonated in a time when police brutality and systemic racism were at the forefront of national conversation. News outlets picked up the story, painting Leah as both a victim of injustice and a powerful figure fighting back. Journalists reached out for interviews, and soon, Leah found herself on national platforms, telling her story and advocating for justice. In one interview, Leah sat in front of a camera, the lights bright, but her demeanor calm and composed. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice clear. "This is about the systemic issues that allow people like Officer Carter to abuse their power. It's about the lives that have been affected by unchecked racism within law enforcement. I'm not fighting for revenge. I'm fighting for accountability." Meanwhile, the department scrambled to defend itself. Officer Carter, still suspended, retained his own legal representation, but his attorney faced an uphill battle. Daniels, knowing his future hung in the balance, was cooperating with Leah's legal team, providing critical information about the toxic culture within the department and the way officers like Carter operated with near impunity. This cooperation marked a turning point in the case. Daniels confirmed what Leah and her team suspected. Carter's behavior wasn't an anomaly, it was part of a broader pattern. Daniels had witnessed firsthand how complaints against officers were ignored or minimized, especially when they involved minority communities. His testimony was crucial, and while it wouldn't absolve him of responsibility, it made the case against Carter and the department much stronger. The lawsuit gained traction, and soon, the city's leadership couldn't ignore it. Pressure mounted from community groups, civil rights activists, and even local politicians who demanded accountability. The media attention didn't wane. If anything, it intensified as more stories of racial profiling and police misconduct within the precinct came to light. Leah knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but they had built a solid case. And as they moved closer to their day in court, she felt a growing sense of resolve. This wasn't just a fight for her dignity, it was a fight for systemic change. Her father, always the strategist, sat with her one evening, looking over the case files. "We've got them on the ropes," he said quietly. "But remember, they're going to fight hard to keep this out of the spotlight. Don't let up." "I won't," Leah replied, determination burning in her eyes. "We've come too far to stop now." The courtroom was packed. Spectators filled the seats, a mix of journalists, activists, and community members who had come to witness what had become one of the most talked about cases in recent memory. The trial had garnered national attention, not just because of Leah's personal story, but because it exposed deep-seated issues of racial bias and abuse of power within the police department. The courtroom was tense, buzzing with the anticipation of what was to come. Leah sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by her legal team, including the civil rights attorney who had taken the case. Her father, Henry, was seated directly behind her, his presence a quiet but steady source of support. He had been with her every step of the way, using his extensive network to provide crucial information and backing. Across the aisle, Officers Carter and Daniels sat with their legal counsel. Carter looked defiant, his jaw set in anger, while Daniels appeared more subdued, clearly uncomfortable with the spotlight on him. As the trial began, the prosecution wasted no time laying out the facts of the case. They presented a clear narrative. Leah Johnson, a respected attorney and upstanding citizen, had been unlawfully detained and humiliated because of her race. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of racial profiling and abuse of power within the police department, spearheaded by Officer Carter, who had a history of complaints against him. Testimonies from other victims of Carter's misconduct were woven into the case, painting a picture of a man who had long acted with impunity, protected by a system that allowed officers like him to thrive. Leah's testimony was pivotal. As she took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She recounted the events of that day in the park, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I was walking, minding my own business, when Officer Carter and his partner approached me," she said. "There was no reason for them to stop me. I wasn't doing anything suspicious or illegal. But the moment I questioned their authority, the situation escalated. Her words were clear and direct, but it was her ability to convey the emotional toll the experience had taken on her that resonated with the jury and the audience. As a Black woman, I've had to live with the constant reality that, no matter how successful or law-abiding I am, I'm still seen as a threat by people like Officer Carter. That day, I wasn't just detained. I was humiliated and made to feel powerless in a system that's supposed to protect me. Henry watched his daughter with pride as she held her composure under cross-examination. The defense tried to paint the situation as a misunderstanding, claiming Carter and Daniels were acting in the interest of public safety. They even attempted to portray Leah as being uncooperative, hoping to shift some of the blame onto her. But Leah, ever the skilled attorney, remained unshaken. "They wanted me to submit to an unlawful search," Leah responded calmly. "I know my rights and I refused. That's not being uncooperative. That's being informed." Officer Daniels' testimony was another key moment in the trial. Under pressure, he confirmed that Carter had pushed the stop without any real justification. "There was no reason to stop her," Daniels admitted, his voice low. "We weren't responding to any reports, and there was nothing suspicious about what she was doing." Carter insisted. When pressed further, Daniels revealed more about the toxic culture in the precinct, acknowledging that officers, especially those like Carter, often operated under a veil of impunity. "Complaints were made," he said, shifting nervously in his seat. "But they didn't go anywhere." Carter was protected. The defense did their best to discredit Daniels, painting him as a disloyal partner, throwing Carter under the bus to save himself. But Daniels' testimony had already done its damage. It painted a clear picture of a department where officers like Carter felt they could act without consequence, knowing that complaints would be ignored or dismissed. As the trial progressed, the community's involvement became impossible to ignore. Outside the courthouse, protests had begun to form. People were holding signs that read, "Justice for Leah," and "End racial profiling." The case had become more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for broader accountability. Civil rights organizations rallied around Leah's case, using it as a rallying cry for reform. It wasn't just about punishing Carter and the department. It was about sending a message that the days of unchecked police misconduct were over. Inside the courtroom, the final blow came when Henry Johnson himself took the stand. His testimony wasn't just as Leah's father, but as a former FBI agent who had spent his career upholding the law. He spoke of his own experiences in law enforcement and how appalled he was by the abuse of power that had led to his daughter's arrest. "This is not just about one bad officer," Henry said, his voice firm and commanding. "It's about a system that allows bad officers to operate freely, without oversight, without accountability. That has to change." Henry's words carried weight, not just because of his reputation, but because they came from someone who had been on the inside. His call for systemic reform rang out in the courtroom, leaving a lasting impact on both the jury and the public. As closing arguments were made, Leah's legal team hammered home the point that this case wasn't just about compensation or retribution. It was about justice. "This trial is about holding people accountable," her attorney said. "It's about sending a message that no one, not even those in positions of power, is above the law." The jury deliberated for hours, but when they returned, the verdict was clear. Officers Carter and Daniels were found liable for violating Leah's civil rights. The jury awarded Leah significant damages, but the real victory came from the ruling that the police department itself bore responsibility for fostering a culture of racial bias and misconduct. As the courtroom erupted in murmurs and the media scrambled to report the verdict, Leah sat still, absorbing the moment. She had won. But more than that, she had helped shine a light on a system that needed change. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled. As Leah and Henry emerged, the cheers of the crowd echoed in the street. Leah stood tall, holding her father's hand as they faced the cameras. She spoke briefly but powerfully, her voice carrying the weight of everything they had fought for. "This is just one victory," she said, "but it's a step toward a future where no one is above the law, and no one has to live in fear of those sworn to protect them." The crowd roared, but Leah knew this wasn't the end. There were still more battles to fight, more changes to push for. But today, she had made a difference, and that was enough to keep her going. She had turned her pain into power, and now, with the world watching, she was ready to keep fighting. The victory in court marked a major turning point, not just for Leah but for the entire community. The trial had revealed the deep cracks in the foundation of the local police department, and now, those cracks were impossible to ignore. The ruling against Officers Carter and Daniels, as well as the police department, sent shockwaves through the city. But as Leah had always known, winning the case in court was just the beginning. Real change would only come if there were consequences, not just for the officers involved, but for the system that had allowed this to happen in the first place. In the weeks that followed the trial, the city was forced to confront its failures. The media attention surrounding Leah's case didn't die down after the verdict. If anything, it intensified. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as part of the larger conversation about police brutality and racial profiling that had gripped the country. Activists and community leaders used Leah's case as a rallying point to push for broader police reform. One of the first consequences was the immediate firing of Officer Carter. The department, facing mounting pressure from both the public and internal reviews, had no choice but to terminate him. He was stripped of his badge and charged with civil rights violations, and the possibility of criminal charges loomed large as the Department of Justice opened its own investigation into his conduct. Carter had always believed he was untouchable, but now, he faced the full weight of the law he had once wielded so recklessly. Officer Daniels, though complicit, received a different fate. His cooperation with Leah's legal team had spared him from the harshest consequences, but his career in law enforcement was effectively over. He resigned from the force before the department could decide on disciplinary action. Leah had mixed feelings about Daniels. On the one hand, his silence had allowed the abuse of power to continue. On the other, he had eventually come forward with the truth. Still, his departure felt like another small step toward accountability. The police department itself faced a reckoning. The internal review that had begun during the trial quickly expanded into a full-blown investigation, uncovering years of misconduct, ignored complaints, and a culture that had enabled officers like Carter to operate without fear of punishment. The city's police chief, who had initially tried to downplay the incident, was forced to resign after mounting evidence showed that his department had turned a blind eye to systemic issues. His resignation was a significant victory for the community, but for many, it wasn't enough. Calls for broader reforms grew louder. Community organizations, civil rights groups, and local leaders demanded that the city take concrete steps to address the racial biases and lack of accountability within the police force. Leah, now an increasingly prominent figure in the fight for justice, was at the forefront of these efforts. She spoke at town halls, gave interviews to the press, and worked closely with lawmakers to craft legislation aimed at reforming the police department from the ground up. One of the key pieces of reform was the introduction of an independent civilian oversight board. This board, made up of community members, would be responsible for reviewing complaints against the police, ensuring that no officer could escape scrutiny the way Carter had for so long. Leah had pushed hard for this reform, knowing that it was essential for restoring trust between the police and the community. The board's creation was a direct result of her case, and it represented a significant shift in how the city handled allegations of police misconduct. In addition to the oversight board, the city implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation and implicit bias. Officers were required to undergo regular evaluations, and the department began recruiting more officers from diverse backgrounds in an effort to better reflect the communities they served. Leah knew that these reforms were just a starting point, but they were necessary steps toward creating a more just and equitable system. While the city began to take its first steps toward reform, Leah and her father continued their work behind the scenes. Henry's connections within federal law enforcement had been crucial in bringing attention to Leah's case, but now, he was using those same connections to push for broader change. He reached out to former colleagues at the FBI and the Department of Justice, advocating for more oversight of local police departments, particularly those with a history of racial profiling and misconduct. Together, Leah and Henry became a powerful force for change. They weren't just focused on their city anymore. They were pushing for national reforms, leveraging Leah's story as an example of what needed to change across the country. Their efforts caught the attention of lawmakers at the state and federal levels, and soon, Leah was meeting with senators and congresspeople, discussing the need for nationwide police reform legislation. But for Leah, this fight was deeply personal. Despite the public attention and the legislative victories, she remained focused on the individuals her case had impacted. She met with other victims of police misconduct, listening to their stories and offering her support. Some had lost loved ones to police violence. Others had been harassed or falsely accused like her. Each story added fuel to Leah's determination to keep pushing for change. One of the most emotional moments for Leah came when she visited a local community center to speak with young Black and brown students about her experience. She stood in front of a group of teenagers, their eyes wide with a mixture of admiration and fear as they listened to her story. "You have every right to demand respect," Leah told them. "No one should ever make you feel like you don't belong, like your rights don't matter. And when they do, you fight back. You fight like I did." After her talk, a young girl approached her. She was about 14, her hair tied back in a ponytail, her face serious. "I want to be a lawyer like you," the girl said quietly. "I want to fight for people like us." Leah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You can," she said. "And when you do, I'll be right there to help you." Moments like these reminded Leah why she had started this fight in the first place. It wasn't just about winning a court case or changing policies. It was about empowering others to stand up for their rights. It was about creating a world where young Black girls like her wouldn't have to live in fear of being profiled, harassed, or unjustly detained. As the months passed, Leah's case became a symbol of hope and resilience, not just for her city, but for communities across the country. The reforms she had helped push through were just the beginning, and she knew that there was still much work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like real progress was being made. Her father, ever the stoic presence in her life, continued to stand by her side. "You've done good, Leah," he said one evening as they sat together, reflecting on everything that had happened. "I'm proud of you." Leah smiled, feeling the weight of his words. "We've done this together," she replied. "And we're not done yet." Henry nodded. "No, we're not. But we've made a damn good start." And with that, Leah knew that no matter how long the road ahead might be, she was ready for it. The fight for justice, for equality, and for a better future was far from over. But she had proven that change was possible, and now, with the world watching, she was determined to keep pushing forward. Months after the trial had concluded, the city still felt the aftershocks of the case. For many, it was a long overdue reckoning, but for Leah, the fight had not yet fully settled. The courtroom victory, though substantial, had not healed the deeper wounds left by years of systemic injustice. Leah's days were now filled with meetings, consultations, and public appearances as she worked alongside civil rights groups and legal advocates to ensure that the momentum created by her case would not be wasted. The police department, in response to the public outcry and the legal defeat, had undergone a series of transformations. The newly established Civilian Oversight Board was now actively investigating past complaints, reopening cases that had previously been dismissed or ignored. The board had subpoena power, meaning officers could no longer hide behind department bureaucracy, and Carter's case had set the tone for the kind of accountability that the city demanded. However, one crucial moment was still ahead: the criminal trial of Officer Carter. While the civil case had already resulted in Carter's firing and the significant damages awarded to Leah, the criminal case had taken more time to prepare. The Department of Justice had launched an investigation into Carter's history of misconduct, and the evidence they found was damning. He wasn't just guilty of what he had done to Leah. There were other victims. Testimonies from people who had been harassed, falsely arrested, and, in some cases, brutalized by Carter began to emerge. The courtroom for the criminal trial was filled with many of the same faces from the civil case, but this time, the stakes were different. Carter now faced criminal charges for violating Leah's civil rights and for the physical and emotional harm he had inflicted. The prosecution was also pursuing charges related to other cases of abuse, attempting to paint a full picture of the kind of officer Carter had been. Leah attended the trial, though this time she wasn't a witness. She was there to see justice completed. She sat quietly in the courtroom, watching as the prosecution laid out the pattern of abuse Carter had engaged in over the years. It was difficult to sit through, hearing stories that echoed her own, but she knew how important it was to be there. for herself and for the others who had been victimized by Carter. The trial stretched on for days. Carter's defense team tried to argue that he had been following procedures, that his actions were justified by the situations he faced. But the prosecution, with a wealth of evidence and the testimonies of Carter's victims, dismantled those arguments one by one. They showed the jury that Carter had not just made a mistake the day he arrested Leah. He had been part of a broader culture of corruption and abuse within the department. On the final day of the trial, Carter took the stand in his own defense. His demeanor had changed since the civil trial. The arrogance and bravado were gone, replaced by a sullen, defensive attitude. He tried to downplay his actions, claiming that he had never intended to harm anyone, but the prosecution was relentless. "Officer Carter," the prosecutor said, standing in front of the jury, "you had complaints filed against you on numerous occasions. You were accused of racial profiling, excessive force, and unlawful detainment. How do you explain that?" Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I did my job," he muttered. "It's not my fault if people don't like how I did it." "Your job was to protect and serve," the prosecutor countered, "not to terrorize innocent people based on the color of their skin. Isn't that right?" Carter didn't respond. When the closing arguments were made, the prosecution urged the jury to see Carter for what he was, a man who had abused his power for far too long, who had left a trail of pain and injustice behind him. "This is about accountability," the prosecutor said. "It's about making sure that those who are sworn to uphold the law are not above it." The jury deliberated for hours, but when they finally returned with their verdict, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Leah sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. Henry was seated beside her, his expression calm but serious. The judge asked the foreperson to stand. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Carter, guilty on all counts." There was a collective exhale in the room, as though everyone had been holding their breath for those words. For Leah, the moment was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the weight of what she and so many others had endured would never fully go away. Carter was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, no longer the officer who had once wielded his power with impunity. He now faced prison time, a stark consequence for someone who had once believed himself untouchable. As Leah stood to leave the courtroom, a crowd of reporters surged toward her, eager for a statement. She held up her hand, signaling that she would speak, but she took a moment to gather her thoughts. This wasn't just about the verdict, it was about what came next. Facing the cameras, she spoke with the same calm authority that had carried her through the trial. "Today's verdict is a victory, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been wronged by those in power. Officer Carter's conviction sends a clear message that no one is above the law, and that abuse of power will not be tolerated. But this is only one step in a much larger fight. The system that allowed Officer Carter to act with impunity is still in place, and until we dismantle that system, there will be more victims." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "We need reform. We need accountability. And we need to make sure that our police departments are places where justice and fairness are upheld, not abused. I will continue to fight for that change, and I hope that today's verdict is the beginning of a new chapter, where we all work together to build a better, more just society." The reporters shouted more questions, but Leah had said what she needed to say. She turned and walked away from the courthouse, her father by her side, feeling a sense of closure, but also knowing that her work was far from done. In the days that followed, the fallout from the case continued. The police department, already under intense scrutiny, faced even more pressure to reform. More officers came forward with stories of misconduct, and additional investigations were launched into other incidents of abuse. Leah's case had sparked a movement, one that demanded transparency, accountability, and justice not just in her city, but across the country. Leah herself became a prominent advocate for police reform, working with lawmakers to draft legislation that aimed to address the root causes of police misconduct. She continued to speak at events, to meet with community leaders, and to fight for the changes that she knew were necessary. Her case had been a turning point, but she was determined to keep pushing until real, lasting change was achieved. And through it all, she remained grounded by the support of her father, who had taught her the values of strength, resilience, and integrity. Together, they had fought a system that had wronged them, and together, they would continue to fight for a future where justice was not just an ideal, but a reality for everyone. As Leah looked out at the world that had begun to change, she knew there was still a long way to go. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. Hope that with enough perseverance, enough courage, and enough unity, real justice could prevail. In the months following Officer Carter's conviction, Leah Johnson's life took on a new rhythm, one marked not by the singular focus of fighting her own case, but by a broader mission to create systemic change. The victory in court had been monumental, a public and legal acknowledgement that her rights had been violated, and that the officers involved, especially Carter, were responsible for the harm inflicted. But the aftermath of the trial, the deeper reckoning with what came next, was what truly transformed Leah. Sitting in her law office late one evening, Leah found herself reflecting on the whirlwind of events that had taken place since that day in the park. The stacks of legal briefs and documents around her now included not just her case, but those of others who had come forward seeking justice. As a lawyer, she had always fought for her clients, but now, her work carried an even greater weight. She was no longer just an attorney advocating for individuals. She was a voice in a growing movement for police accountability and racial justice. Her phone buzzed on her desk, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her father. "Proud of you, kid. Don't forget to rest." Leah smiled, feeling the warmth of her father's words. Henry Johnson had been her anchor through the entire ordeal. His wisdom, his network of contacts, and his unshakable belief in justice had given her the strength to persevere. But more than anything, it was his quiet strength and his unwavering support that had carried her through the darkest moments. Leah thought about how fortunate she was to have him in her corner, knowing full well that many others who had faced similar injustices didn't have that kind of support. Her thoughts turned to the people she had met over the past few months, the victims of police misconduct who had come forward, emboldened by her case. Their stories were all different, yet hauntingly familiar. Unnecessary traffic stops, unlawful detainments, excessive use of force. Each one was a reminder that, while her personal battle had been won, the larger war against systemic racism and police abuse was still raging. One afternoon, as Leah prepared to leave her office for a meeting with city officials, she received a call from the head of the Civilian Oversight Board. The reforms Leah had pushed for, civilian oversight, mandatory implicit bias training, and stricter guidelines for police accountability, were finally taking shape. The Oversight Board had begun conducting thorough investigations into past complaints, and several officers with troubling records were being put under review. For the first time in years, there was a real sense that the police department was being held to account. "This wouldn't have happened without you," the board's director said over the phone. "Your case really pushed the city to act." Leah thanked her but knew that it wasn't just her. The pressure had come from the community, from the people who had taken to the streets to demand justice, from the media who had refused to let the story die, and from the countless advocates who had fought for years to expose the inequities in the justice system. Leah's case had been a catalyst, but the change was a collective effort. She hung up the phone and took a deep breath. The reforms were a start, but they weren't the end. Real change would take time, and Leah knew there would be setbacks. The police department, like many across the country, had a deeply ingrained culture of protecting its own, and while some officers were being held accountable, others would resist. But now, there were eyes on them. An engaged public, a vigilant oversight board, and advocates like Leah who would ensure that the old ways of doing things were no longer tolerated. That evening, Leah attended a town hall meeting in a community center packed with residents, activists, and city officials. She sat quietly in the audience, listening as people voiced their concerns and frustrations about the police, about inequality, about the challenges they still faced in their daily lives. A young man stood up, his voice trembling as he recounted a story about being stopped by police just for walking through his own neighborhood. Leah's heart tightened as she heard his story, so similar to her own. When it was Leah's turn to speak, she stood at the front of the room, her posture confident but her tone empathetic. "I know what it feels like to be targeted," she began, her voice calm but full of conviction. "I know what it feels like to be treated as if you don't belong, as if your rights don't matter. But I also know that we have the power to change that." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had come to hear her. The verdict in my case was a victory, but it wasn't just my victory. It was a victory for all of us who have ever been mistreated, profiled, or wronged by a system that was supposed to protect us. But we can't stop here. We have to keep pushing for accountability, for transparency, and for justice, for everyone. The crowd responded with applause, but Leah didn't dwell on it. She knew that speeches and town halls were only part of the solution. The real work was in the legislation, the policy changes, the constant pressure on those in power to do the right thing. She had seen how hard it was to make change happen, and she was ready to keep fighting. As she left the meeting, Leah was approached by a young woman, not much older than 20, with wide, searching eyes. "You've inspired me," the woman said softly. "I'm studying law because I want to do what you're doing." Leah smiled, a sense of pride and hope welling up inside her. "That's great," she said. "We need more people like you in this fight. If you ever need advice or guidance, reach out. I'll be here." The young woman nodded, her face lighting up with gratitude, and Leah realized that the legacy of her fight wasn't just in the courtroom victories or the reforms. It was in the people she had inspired to join the movement for justice. Later that night, Leah sat on the porch of her father's house, the two of them enjoying the quiet together. The air was cool, and the sky was full of stars. Henry, sitting in his usual chair with a glass of bourbon in hand, looked over at Leah with a sense of peace. "You've done a lot of good, Leah," he said, his voice gentle. "You've made me proud." Leah smiled, feeling the weight of his words. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, Dad," she replied. "You taught me how to fight, how to stand up for what's right." Henry nodded, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of his years. "It's not over," he said, reminding her that the journey was far from complete. "But you're on the right path, and you've got a lot of people walking it with you now." Leah looked out at the night sky, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and purpose. She had faced injustice and fought back. She had helped bring accountability where there had been none. But most importantly, she had become a symbol of resilience, of courage, and of the possibility of change. The road ahead would be long, and the fight would be difficult. But as Leah sat there, surrounded by the quiet strength of her father and the hope she had sparked in others, she knew she was ready. Justice wasn't just a destination, it was a journey, and Leah Johnson was prepared to walk it for as long as it took. As she leaned back in her chair, watching the stars above, she whispered to herself the words that had carried her through the darkest days. "We're not done yet." And with that, she knew the fight would continue. But she would never be alone in it again. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and watch this next story. It's really emotional.